They laughed when he bought the $1 shack by the abandoned mine. Said the war broke his mind. Said no sane man would live that close to a place where people vanished without answers. But the jokes stopped the night his dog crawled out from under the floorboards, ribs shaking, teeth muddy, carrying something no one in Mill Creek ever wanted unearthed. A metal tag, a missing man's name, and a truth buried so deep the town had learned to forget it. Grant Holloway wasn't looking for trouble, but Shadow had found it, and nothing loyal ever turns back from the dark. The wind hit the valley first, slipping through the dead pines, brushing against old warning signs that hung crooked along the fence line of the abandoned Echo Ridge mine. By the time it reached the edge of Mill Creek, Montana, it carried the cold, metallic bite of a place that had seen too much history to stay quiet. Grant Holloway stepped out of his rusted sedan and closed the door gently, as if loud noises might shatter something fragile inside him. Maybe they would. His ribs still tightened at sudden sounds, his throat still locked up at the memory of men calling his name and fading before he could reach them. He had tried to bury the past across miles of highway. It followed him anyway. The tiny house stood 10 yards ahead, tilted like it had been placed there by accident and forgotten. A single window. A sagging porch. The roof slouched downward as if tired of its own job. Behind it rose the dark mouth of the abandoned mine. The land dipped there, shadowed and silent, a wound still open after decades. Shadow hopped out of the car and shook himself, sending a mist of dust into the cold air. His coat was black and tan, thick around the neck, battle scars hidden beneath fur. His eyes, sharp and deliberate, scanned the tree line, the porch steps, the mine entrance. He moved like someone who had memorized danger. Grant rested a hand on the dog's head. Okay, this is home now. It sounded braver than he felt. A truck rolled past on the road. 2 men leaned out the window, laughing loud enough for their voices to echo across the empty lot. One lifted his phone to take a picture. Look at that. The Marine bought a toy house. You sure you're safe out here, Holloway? We got a mine full of ghosts. Might be too much for the PTSD hero. They drove off before Grant could respond. Not that he would have. He had learned the cost of reacting. Shadow pressed against his leg, ears pinned back, chest stiff. Grant knelt, steadying him. They don't know any better, but the words tasted like old ash. He picked up his duffel and headed for the porch. The boards groaned under his weight, the sound too hollow, too fragile. The front door resisted, then scraped open, spilling stale air that smelled of old timber and long-forgotten insulation. The house was a single room. A bulb dangled from an exposed beam. No bathroom, no closet. Barely a home at all. But it was his, and for $1 that was enough! Shadow circled the space immediately, nose to the floor, moving with purpose. He had done this in bombed-out buildings overseas, in compounds where silence meant ambush. Here, he paused near the far corner, ears rising like antennas locking onto a frequency only he could hear. Grant noticed the shift. What is it? Shadow gave no answer. He pressed his paw to the floorboard. A soft, almost delicate thump followed. Metal, not wood. Grant frowned and tapped the plank with his knuckle. The sound came again. Hollow, too precise, too engineered. The same ring he remembered from hidden compartments in old military outposts. A chill ran down his spine. He forced out a breath. It's just old construction, boy. But Shadow didn't move. His tail stiffened, not from fear, from confirmation. Grant tried to distract himself. He unpacked a few things, fixed the bent front latch, and pushed his sleeping bag into a corner. Night settled quickly in Mill Creek. The mine behind the house darkened into something heavier than just a shadow, something that felt like memory waiting to surface. Thunder groaned over the ridge. Rain followed, tapping hard against the roof, sliding through cracks in the shingles. Grant sat on the floor beside Shadow, listening to the storm. The rhythm almost calmed him until a deeper sound cut through it. A second metallic echo. Stronger this time. Shadow stood instantly. Not startled. Ready? He lowered his head, muscles coiled, staring at the same board as before. Grant felt a slow, tightening crawl up his spine. He placed his palm on the plank. It was cold, colder than the surrounding wood. The temperature shift was impossible to ignore. Then it happened. A third metallic click. This one from beneath the floor, unmistakably deliberate, as if someone or something had reset a mechanism after decades of sleep. Shadow growled low, the kind of sound that once saved Grant's life outside Kandahar, a sound that meant move or die. Grant scrambled back, heart pounding. The storm outside cracked with lightning, illuminating the small room. A moment later, the lights flickered, even though the bulb wasn't connected to power. Grant froze. He had seen that before, too. Old emergency lines in forgotten bases sometimes carried a ghost current. But here there was no grid, no wiring, nothing that should hum back to life. Shadow placed himself between Grant and the floorboard, stanced firm, gaze locked downward as if guarding him from whatever stirred below. Grant swallowed hard. This place is wrong. Another thunder roll shook the valley. The mine's wind tunnels moaned behind the house, a hollow, almost human sound. Shadow didn't flinch. He watched the floor, breathing slow, controlled, unafraid. A soldier on watch. Grant lowered himself beside the dog, trembling despite himself. Shadow leaned into him, grounding him, reminding him that they had survived worse together. Gunfire, collapsed buildings, men screaming in dust storms, nightmares that didn't stop when daylight came. But this was different. This wasn't memory. This was present. Grant placed a hand on Shadow's shoulders. Whatever's down there, we face it tomorrow. Not tonight. Shadow didn't relax. He kept watching the floor long after Grant closed his eyes. Outside, the mine whispered with the wind. Inside, the tiny house exhaled like something waking up. And beneath it, behind a single loose board, the metal stirred again. Morning found Mill Creek wrapped in a thin veil of fog that clung to the ground like something unwilling to rise. Grant stepped out of the tiny house with Shadow at his heel, the cold air sharp enough to sting his lungs. The storm had passed, but the land still looked tense, as if holding on to whatever stirred beneath it last night. Shadow lowered his nose to the dirt the moment they stepped onto the gravel path. He wasn't sniffing for routine. This was focus, the kind he used overseas when he picked up traces of explosive powder or the faint imprint of a boot in sand. His tail leveled, his steps turned deliberate. Each footfall had purpose. Grant followed, uncertain. "What is it, boy?" Shadow didn't look back. He continued pulling him towards the rear of the property where the land dipped. Beyond that dip, the abandoned mine entrance yawned open, a dark scar in the hillside, fenced off with rusted wire and old government warnings half swallowed by weeds. Grant hesitated when Shadow stopped at the ridgeline. The dog stared at the mine, head tilted, ears pricked forward. Something in his posture changed, stiffened, as if he recognized a frequency Grant couldn't hear. Grant knelt beside him and rested a hand on his neck. It is just an old mine. But even as he said it, he felt the lie. Mines collapse for natural reasons. Mines get fenced off. Mines get forgotten. But mines don't echo in the middle of storms. Mines don't hum beneath a house. Shadow exhaled sharply, nudging Grant toward the cave mouth. Grant pulled him back gently. "No, we are not going in there." Shadow resisted but didn't fight. He stood his ground until Grant coaxed him away. Only when they reached the path to the main road did the dog loosen up, but he never stopped glancing over his shoulder. By the time they reached the center of Mill Creek, The fog had lifted enough to reveal faces in porch windows, staring, whispering, pulling back curtains only after Grant had already seen them. At the general store, 2 older men lingered by a coffee thermos. One muttered loud enough for Grant to hear. Should have kept that mine closed. They sealed it off for a reason. Dangerous stuff under there. Not all rock. The other replied, "No one tells the real reason they shut Echo Ridge. Something happened down there." Grant tried to ignore them. The floorboard echoes from last night still pulsed in the back of his mind like a second heartbeat. He grabbed a bag of feed for Shadow and headed to the counter. But as he stepped out of the store, the last person he wanted to see ambled up the sidewalk with a swagger that announced trouble long before he spoke. Earl Maddox. Earl was the kind of man who made noise just to hear himself do it. Hat tilted back, thumbs hooked into his belt, grin smeared across his face like he'd painted it on that morning. He caught sight of Shadow first. Look at that. A soldier dog watching over a broken soldier. Hell of a pair. Grant's jaw tightened. Keep walking. Earl stepped in front of him, forcing Grant to stop. You settle in your dollhouse yet? Thought the wind might blow it into the mine? People on the sidewalk slowed, turning to watch. Mill Creek was starving for entertainment, and Earl loved being the one to provide it. Grant tried to move past him. Earl blocked him again. Folks say that mine was shut down after something went wrong. Real wrong. Sounds about right for someone like you to move in next door. Grant's vision blurred at the edges. Noise, pressure, the smell of damp soil, a taste of dust in the back of his throat. It came fast, like it always did. A narrow alley overseas, men shouting, the ground shaking, Shadow barking frantic warnings. His breathing quickened, chest clenching so hard he staggered back. Earl smirked. Look at that. Can't even stand still without shaking. What did they do to you over there? Shadow moved before Grant could break. The dog pressed into him, shoulder firm against his thigh, positioning himself between Grant and Earl, with a low growl vibrating through the pavement. Grant felt the world sharpen, refocus. He grabbed Shadow's harness, grounding himself through the dog's steady weight. We are leaving. Earl stepped back with a theatrical flourish, hands up as if warding off a threat. Watch out now. That dog might be more stable than you are. Grant didn't respond. He walked away, Shadow glued to his side, chest still heaving until the town fell behind them. They returned to the tiny house by late afternoon. The sky had cleared, but the mine behind the property loomed larger somehow, as if listening. Grant tried to focus on repairs. He hammered loose siding, replaced a warped hinge, swept out a corner full of debris. But every time the wind shifted, it carried a faint metallic note that didn't belong in nature. Shadow heard it too. His ears twitched each time, body instantly alert. By dusk, tension had settled in the tiny house like an invisible fog. Grant knelt to light the small stove, but Shadow didn't move towards the heat like he usually did. Instead, he paced the room, slow, measured steps tracing a perfect circle. He stopped at the same spot as last night, the floorboard. Shadow lowered his nose, sniffed once, then began to dig. His claws scraped hard against the old wood. Grant jumped up. Hey, stop! You're going to hurt yourself. But the dog kept going, not frantic, determined, controlled, as if following a signal buried beneath the earth. Grant grabbed Shadow's shoulders, pulling him back, gently. The dog resisted, letting out a frustrated bark that echoed off the cramped walls. Grant pressed a hand to the plank. This time, the board shifted. A thin scrape of metal whispered up through the wood. Grant's breath caught. Shadow barked once, sharply. Confirmation. Grant pulled the board. It didn't come loose easily, but when it finally gave, the edge lifted just enough to reveal a sliver of dull steel beneath it. A seam. Straight. Precise. Hidden. Shadow crouched beside him, staring at the crack like it was the first honest thing he had seen since they arrived. Grant whispered without meaning to. "Someone hid a door under my house." But Shadow wasn't interested in Grant's shock. He was staring into the seam as if waiting for whatever lived below to move again. His tail stiffened. His breathing slowed to a soldier's rhythm. Grant felt the air change, heavy, electric, watching. Shadow nudged the plank once more, forcing the gap to widen another inch. And from somewhere deep beneath the tiny house, something answered with a distant metallic click that didn't belong to time or settling wood. Grant froze. Shadow did not. He stepped forward, ready. For a long moment, Grant just knelt there, staring at the thin seam of metal beneath the lifted floorboard. Shadow stood rigid beside him, breath steady, eyes locked on the gap as though daring it to move again. The tiny house felt too quiet, like the silence had wrapped itself around the two of them and was listening. Grant finally exhaled, bracing his hands on the wooden plank. "All right, let's see what you found." The board resisted at first, swollen from years of damp air, but Grant wedged his fingers beneath the lifted edge and pulled harder. The entire panel slid with a soft, grinding sound, gliding along concealed metal runners. Not broken. Designed. Shadow stepped closer, watching every motion. Underneath, a square opening stretched downward into darkness. A thin ladder was bolted to the side, its rungs coated with dust but intact. A cold draft drifted up from below, carrying a smell Grant hadn't encountered since his last deployment. Steel, old wiring, stale air. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter. This was something built with intention. Shadow gave a short huff, a sound halfway between warning and encouragement. Grant clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through dust as he lowered himself onto the first rung. The metal chilled his palms. Shadow whined but didn't try to stop him. Grant took that as permission. He climbed down slowly, one rung at a time, until his boots touched solid ground. He turned in a slow circle. The chamber lit up in segments as the flashlight beam swept across it. The walls were metal, riveted, reinforced. Not the work of a farmer or a paranoid survivalist. This was government steel, built to last decades. Shadow descended behind him, landing in a crouch beside Grant. The dog inhaled deeply, nose working the air, then moved ahead with cautious steps, scanning corners with the same precision he once used to clear safe houses overseas. A narrow hallway extended from the chamber. The walls carried faint markings, scratched numbers, and a few rusted arrows pointing toward the mine's direction. Shadow led the way, stopping only when the hallway opened into a low room lined with metal shelves. Grant shined the light across the shelves. Folders. Dozens of them. Their labels worn to near nothing. Some had water damage. Others were perfectly preserved, sealed in plastic sleeves long gone opaque with age. Grant reached for one of the dry folders. When he opened it, a cloud of dust rose like ghostly breath. Inside, diagrams and reports lay yellowed but legible. Words jumped at him through the haze. Mine Project Echo Ridge, Federal Observation Site. Unauthorized access prohibited. Grant's stomach tightened. Echo Ridge was the name of the collapsed mine. He had heard it whispered earlier in town that it was closed for reasons no one wanted to discuss. And now he stood beneath a house sitting right on its edge, holding paperwork tied to the same project. Shadow nudged his knee, guiding his attention to a second table against the wall. On it stood a radio. Heavy. Military issue. The kind used long before Grant enlisted, yet recently wiped clean. A fresh fingerprint streaked across the dust. Not old, not ancient. Someone had touched it. Grant brushed the tuning dial gently. The static that bled through the speakers was faint, but alive. He stepped back, suddenly aware of how exposed he was in this hidden room. Someone had been here, maybe even recently. Shadow stiffened, ears rising sharply. He stared at the far end of the room where a second hallway branched off. Grant lifted the flashlight and swept the beam toward it. Tracks. No footprints in dust, not exactly. But the dust had been disturbed in two narrow trails, like something or someone had moved through the corridor within the last few days. Grant crouched, fingers trembling as he touched the disturbed patch. Whatever had passed here wasn't an animal. The spacing was too precise, too deliberate. Boot patterns were faint at the edges, as if someone had tried to erase their trail without fully succeeding. Grant's pulse quickened. Whoever accessed this place still cared enough to hide their visits, still active, not someone who built this decades ago and forgot it existed. Shadow moved closer to Grant, pressing his shoulder against him. It was a gesture he used only in the field, when Grant was seconds away from walking into something wrong. Grant looked around the chamber again, softer this time. The thick steel door in the corner, the sealed drawers beneath the table. The way the ventilation tubes in the ceiling led directly towards the direction of the mine. This wasn't shelter. This was a research outpost, a covert one, hidden under a house nobody wanted, right beside a mine sealed under suspicious circumstances. Shadow nudged him again, more forcefully this time. His head turned towards the ladder, urging Grant upward. Grant stood, still gripping the folder marked Echo Ridge. The air felt heavier now. Alive. Like the place was waiting to see what he would do. He whispered without thinking. Someone built this for a reason, and they never meant for it to be found. Shadow huffed in agreement. He circled behind Grant, ready to climb. Grant took one last look at the room, the radio, the files, the footprints, the truth breathing beneath the surface. Then he climbed the ladder. When he reached the floor of the tiny house, he slid the board back into place, dusting over the seam until it disappeared. Shadow sat beside him, chest rising and falling slow. Patient. Grant looked at him, and for the first time since stepping foot in Mill Creek, he said the truth out loud. This house wasn't abandoned. It was chosen. Grant woke before sunrise, long before the frost loosened its grip on the hillside. Sleep had been thin and restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the metal room beneath the house, the trail of disturbed dust, the radio that should not have been touched in decades. Shadow lay beside him, eyes open, already awake, watching the door, listening. Grant sat up, rubbed the back of his neck, and grabbed the folder he brought from below. The pages crackled softly in the cold air. He scanned through the documents again, slower this time. Most of the text was technical, mapping shafts and ventilation routes from the Echo Ridge mine to underground annexes. But tucked between the diagrams sat a personnel roster. Men assigned to the mine's final months before the collapse. Some names were crossed out with thick ink. Others were underlined. Grant traced down the list until he saw one that made his breath pause. Kane, Robert J. Security Supervisor, Echo Ridge Facility. Sheriff Kane. The man who had greeted him with a polite smile on his first day. The man everyone in town treated like a father figure. The man who, according to this file, had been part of a government-controlled operation inside the mine shortly before the collapse was declared a tragic engineering failure. Shadow lifted his head, sensing the shift. Grant whispered, "Sheriff Kane was here, before everything went wrong." Shadow stepped closer and pressed his nose to the page, tracing the scent of old ink and dust. Grant stood. "We are going to town. I need answers." Shadow followed him to the truck, but as Grant placed the key in the ignition, the dog stiffened suddenly. Ears up, tail straight, eyes fixed on the tiny house. Grant felt the tension rise like a static charge. Shadow bolted from the truck without waiting for a command, sprinting back toward the porch. Grant ran after him. The front door was slightly open. Grant had closed it. He remembered the click of the latch. Someone had been inside. Shadow growled low as he crossed the doorway, scanning left and right with practiced precision. Grant entered behind him, holding his breath as he looked around. Someone had searched carefully. Not a smash and grab, a systematic sweep. The chair near the table was an inch out of place. The blanket on his sleeping cot had been disturbed. The dust around the floorboard seam was faintly brushed aside, almost imperceptibly. Someone had checked the hidden door but hadn't figured out how to open it. Shadow moved with purpose, nose close to the floor, tracing a track across the room. He stopped at the far corner near the window. A faint print in the dust. Not a full boot print, but enough to show the pattern. Tactical, narrow, professional. Grant's pulse quickened. Whoever searched the house was not Earl Maddox or any town gossip. This was someone trained, someone who knew how to avoid leaving a trail but didn't expect a dog-like shadow. Grant backed away from the window. Someone is watching this place. They know about the room. Shadow lifted his head and snarled at the door frame, where a faint impression on the wood stood out. Scrape marks from a gloved hand. The intruder paused there before leaving. Grant checked outside. The tire marks near the house didn't match any truck from Mill Creek. New all-terrain treads, no dust in the grooves. They had driven in recently. Last night. Maybe while he slept. He swallowed hard. The thought of someone standing in that quiet room while he and Shadow rested above it tightened his chest. A sudden sound in the distance snapped both of their attention. A car engine. Slow. Approaching. Grant stepped aside from the window and watched as a white patrol SUV rolled past on the gravel road. Sheriff Kane's vehicle. He slowed almost imperceptibly as he passed Grant's driveway, eyes hidden behind sunglasses even though the sun was still low. Shadow moved closer to Grant, posture tense but silent. Kane tipped his hand in a casual wave, then drove on. Grant didn't wave back. He couldn't. He waited until the SUV disappeared behind a ridge before letting out the breath he'd been holding. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Grant packed the roster sheet into his jacket and headed toward town. If Kane was involved, Grant needed to confirm it somewhere private. But before he reached the truck, Shadow tensed again. Barking once, sharply, he sprinted behind the house. Grant followed, lungs burning from the cold. Shadow stopped near the tree line. A single object lay partially buried under a patch of disturbed soil. Grant knelt and brushed away the dirt. A small listening device. Black. Military grade. Designed to transmit short-range surveillance audio. Someone had planted it less than 15 feet from his home. Grant's chest tightened. This was no longer about the mine. Someone was monitoring him directly. He looked around. The trees stood motionless. The wind had gone dead. Every instinct he had honed in combat screamed at him simultaneously. Shadow pressed close to him with a protective posture he had not used since Afghanistan. Grant whispered, "We need to move carefully." Back inside the house, Grant sat at the table with Shadow beside him. He opened the personnel file again, letting the name Kane settle like a weight in his hands. Why was the sheriff's name tied to a secret research annex in the mine? What had been hidden down there, and who else had been assigned to Project Echo Ridge before the collapse? Shadow nudged the radio with his nose. Grant paused. The radio had picked up faint static yesterday. Old equipment sometimes catches stray signals, but this felt different, like someone else was using it. Grant adjusted the dial with slow, deliberate movements. Static crackled, then faded. For a heartbeat, a faint clicking pattern emerged. Not Morse code, but structured, repeated, deliberate. Shadow's ears shot upward. Grant froze. Someone was transmitting from somewhere near the mine, and someone else had been inside the house last night, trying to see how much he knew. The tiny house no longer felt like the quiet refuge he had hoped for. It felt like a trap. Or worse, a piece on a board someone else was controlling. Grant stood. Shadow followed immediately. This place wasn't abandoned, not by a long shot. And now they were both in the middle of something that had been buried for decades, but was waking back to life. Shadow stayed at his side, posture guarded, eyes locked on the door, ready for whatever would come next. Grant sat at the small wooden table, the old military radio resting in front of him, like a relic dredged up from some forgotten battlefield. The morning sun pushed a thin beam through the cracked blinds, cutting across the metal casing. Shadow lay beside him, but not relaxed. His ears rotated with every shift of static, his body alert as if waiting for something to return. Grant turned the dial again, slow and steady. Static rose, fell, then sharpened into a faint clicking rhythm. Not random, not interference. Patterned, repeating every 8 seconds. Shadow's head snapped toward the radio just as Grant leaned in closer. He whispered, "That's not local chatter." He listened again. The clicking ran in short pulses. Pause. 2 long pulses. Pause, repeat. Grant felt the air thicken. This was the old emergency signaling protocol used in forward operating bases overseas, a fallback system designed for when voice comms failed. It had been phased out decades ago, but Grant knew it. He remembered Captain Reed drilling it into their unit, insisting they learn the old systems because newer tech always broke in the worst moments. Grant's stomach tightened. Someone near Echo Ridge was triggering a distress cycle meant for emergencies only. And they were using a code obsolete to everyone except older military personnel. Shadow whined low, sensing the shift in Grant's breathing. Grant turned off the radio. It didn't matter how old the equipment was. Signals needed power. Someone was supplying it, someone alive. He grabbed his flashlight, moved quickly to the hidden floorboard, and lifted it. Shadow descended first without being asked, landing softly, scanning the chamber as if expecting a threat. Grant followed. The air below felt colder, the way abandoned places sometimes hold on to time. But tonight it felt different. Charged. Waiting. He moved to the back of the room, where a stack of old equipment cases sat covered in dust. One metal box, smaller than the rest, had a latch that had been recently disturbed. Grant brushed his fingers across it. Fresh fingerprints cut through the dust. He swallowed hard. Whoever had broken into the tiny house the night before had also come down here. But they had missed this box. Or maybe they hadn't been looking for it. Grant unlatched it. Inside lay a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its casing dented but intact. He pressed the power switch. Nothing. He checked the compartment. A backup battery still sat inside. Dead but replaceable. He grabbed one from a nearby drawer, slid it in, and tried again. The recorder hummed to life. Shadow moved closer, leaning into Grant's leg. Grant pressed play. Static filled the room, then cleared into a voice strained by exhaustion. "This is Captain Jonathan Reed, Echo Ridge Annex. If someone finds this, the project is compromised. Repeat, compromised." Grant froze. Reed had been more than a superior officer. He was the man who had pulled Grant out of burning metal during their last deployment, the man who had taught him how to survive when survival no longer felt possible. The voice continued, weaker now. "They are abandoning the project. They want it wiped clean. They say the collapse was an accident, but it wasn't. Kane authorized a shutdown after the last drill malfunctioned. Seismic readings spiked beyond threshold. The ground started to move. We felt it under our feet. Grant's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear. Shadow pressed closer, sensing the tremor in Grant's hands. Reed's breath came ragged through the speakers. They built something beneath this mine, a sensor system designed to detect enemy tunnels overseas. But something went wrong. The readings don't match human movement. It is deeper, older. They are trying to bury it. Grant leaned forward, chest tight. Reed's voice dropped to a whisper. If I don't make it out, tell my unit. Tell them I didn't abandon them. I followed Kane here. I thought I could stop him. But he sealed the upper shaft before I reached daylight. A choking sound. Metal groaned in the background. Reed's final words cracked through the static like breaking bone. If anyone hears this, the collapse that killed those miners, the data Kane stole, it all connects. And if my men died overseas, it is because of what started in this mine. Grant's vision blurred, rage and disbelief crashing together inside him. The tape clicked off. Shadow nudged him once, firmly, grounding him. Grant gripped the dog's fur, pulling strength from the warmth beneath his palm. Captain Reed hadn't died in the field. He had died here, trying to expose something Kane helped bury. Grant staggered back, breath shaking. All the pieces began to align in a way that made him feel sick. His unit's last mission had gone wrong, without explanation. Enemies had found them in a valley no one should have known. Their routes had been compromised. Reed had suspected it. Grant had felt it. And now, the truth was sitting beneath a house no one wanted to live in. Echo Ridge was not a forgotten mine. It was a grave site, a cover, a place where a project had gone wrong and been buried with the people it consumed. Shadow stepped between Grant and the recorder, as if shielding him from a memory come too close. Grant whispered, "This wasn't random. None of it." The dog stared at him, unblinking, understanding in his eyes. Grant rose slowly. He no longer believed he found the tiny house by chance. He no longer believed the mine collapse was an accident. And he no longer believed the nightmares from Afghanistan were unconnected. Someone had used Project Echo Ridge to experiment with seismic detection. Someone who knew the system, could track underground movement. Someone who learned it could detect other things. Someone who later used that information to track enemy tunnels overseas. Someone who had been there from the beginning. Sheriff Kane. Shadow growled softly, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. Grant placed a hand on his head. "We're going to finish what Reed started." The old tape recorder sat silent in the dim light, but the truth it carried was awake now, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the abandoned mine. And somewhere above ground, the man who buried it was still watching. Grant had barely set his boots on the floor of the tiny house when Shadow stiffened. Every muscle in the dog's body locked into place, ears pinned, tail straight, eyes fixed on the door. Grant felt the change instantly, the sudden shift in air pressure that he'd learned to trust more than any instinct of his own. Shadow growled, deep and low. Grant whispered, "Talk to me, buddy." Then it happened. The door exploded inward, ripped off the side hinge as a figure in black tactical gear surged inside. Shadow launched first, teeth bared, a blur of instinct and fury. The intruder reacted faster than Grant could blink. A reinforced boot connected with Shadow's ribs in a brutal arc. The impact echoed through the entire cabin. Shadow crashed into the far wall, body folding awkwardly as he slid to the floor. A cry tore from Grant's throat, raw and cracked. He didn't think. He didn't assess. He lunged. The intruder swung again, but this time Grant was ready. He tackled the man sideways, slamming both of them into the crooked kitchen counter. They wrestled, boots scraping the wood, fists striking, elbows driving. Grant's training fought to rise through the fog of rage, But every time he caught sight of Shadow struggling to breathe, the battle became something else, something primal. The man jerked a knee upward, catching Grant's ribs. Grant gasped, lost balance for a heartbeat. The intruder shoved him hard, breaking free and spinning toward the exit. Grant grabbed the attacker's jacket, ripping a large chunk from the sleeve as the man slipped out the door and vanished into the darkness outside. Gravel scattered. A truck engine roared somewhere down the hill. Then silence. Grant stared at the torn fabric while his breath trembled in his chest. On the patch was a faded emblem, one he recognized from briefings and military reports. A private security contractor whose operations had shut down 5 years ago after accusations of illegal data trading. A contractor once hired by Sheriff Robert Kane during the Echo Ridge collapse investigation. Grant's pulse pounded so hard he felt it in his teeth. Shadow whimpered. Grant dropped the fabric and scrambled to him. Kneeling beside the dog, he ran his hands gently along Shadow's ribs. The shepherd's breathing hitched in shallow bursts, but his eyes remained fixed on Grant, alert even through pain. "I'm here," Grant whispered, voice breaking. "I'm right here." Shadow lowered his head into Grant's palm, trusting him completely, even now. Grant felt something hot and violent coil inside him. They had gone after Shadow. They had come into his home, and they were tied directly to Kane. He stood, rage crystallizing into purpose. "We're going back down." Shadow attempted to rise, trembling. Grant placed a steady hand on him. "No, you stay. I won't lose you." Shadow resisted, but eventually lay still, chest rising in uneven breaths. Grant forced himself to turn away. He lifted the loosened floorboard and descended into the tunnel alone. The air below felt colder than ever. He grabbed a lantern, sweeping it across the walls. The dim light revealed markings he hadn't noticed before. Old military paint, directional arrows, hazard warnings. Someone had repurposed this old mine shaft into something else long before the collapse. He followed the narrow tunnel deeper until it opened into a chamber he hadn't reached before. A massive steel door stood half-buried in rock, its hinges warped from the collapse. Grant squeezed through a gap where the metal had buckled, entering a room preserved by time and darkness. The air smelled of dust and rusted electronics. Then he saw it. A mounted video recorder, coated in grime but intact, perched on a tilted desk. As he approached, he saw a note taped to the top. His throat tightened when he read the name. Captain Jonathan Reed. Grant pressed the playback button. The screen came to life with a flicker, cutting through static to reveal Reed's gaunt face, illuminated by a single failing bulb. His voice was ragged, but unmistakable. "If you're watching this, the mine accident wasn't an accident." Grant gripped the edge of the desk. Reed continued. Sheriff Kane and his contractors sold the seismic system to outside groups. They needed testing data. They needed readings. So they triggered controlled detonations in the mine. The blast grew beyond what they planned. It buried the workers and sealed this annex. Reed coughed, leaning closer to the camera. "I followed Kane here. I confronted him. He sealed me inside. And if you're hearing this, he's still covering it up." Grant's vision burned. Reed's voice dropped. "And if the data you found shows your unit's ambush routes, then you know the truth. The leak overseas came from right here. The betrayal that killed your men started in Mill Creek." Grant staggered back, breath collapsing in his chest. The ambush. The valley where they were herded in. The intel that never made sense. It all pointed to Kane. Grant pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. Years of nightmares, guilt, and unanswered questions suddenly snapped into place like iron bars closing around him. His unit died because of Kane's greed. Because the sheriff had sold seismic data that mapped underground pathways used overseas. Because he had traded lives for money. Shadow's distant whine echoed faintly from above, reminding Grant he wasn't alone, that he didn't survive the worst day of his life just to run from the truth. Grant forced himself upright. He whispered into the cold chamber. "I'm going to finish what you started, Captain. I swear it." The lantern flickered, shadows stretching along the metal walls like the ghosts of men who had died, waiting to be heard. Grant turned back toward the ladder, toward Shadow, toward Mill Creek. He wasn't just uncovering secrets anymore. He was preparing for war. Shadow limped beside Grant as they made their way down the icy road into Mill Creek. The sun had barely risen, but the town was already awake. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open. People stared from porches with the same mix of suspicion and curiosity they had shown since the day he arrived. Except now, Grant wasn't walking in with nothing but a battered duffel bag and a dog. He carried a folder thick with evidence, a flash drive, a damaged video recorder, and the final testimony of Captain Jonathan Reed. Shadow's steps were careful, ribs wrapped in bandages, but he refused to stay behind. Grant had tried 3 times. Each time the dog dragged himself to the doorway and planted his body there until Grant gave up. "Fine," Grant whispered as they reached Main Street. "But no pushing yourself. Stay close." Shadow bumped his leg firmly, as if reminding him who had been protecting whom all along. They reached the diner first. People quieted the moment they walked in. Coffee mugs hovered mid-air. Conversations froze. The tension was so thick it almost stopped Grant at the door. Almost. He walked to the counter and placed the folder on it, spine upward, like laying a truth too heavy to carry by hand. Carla, the owner, frowned. "Grant, what is this?" "Evidence," he said. "About the mine collapse. About why my unit died, overseas." Carla blinked in confusion. Others in the diner leaned forward, trying to listen without looking like they were listening. Before Grant could open the folder, the door slammed behind him. Sheriff Robert Kane strode in, boots pounding like he owned the floorboards. His eyes were already locked on Grant, jaw tight, hand brushing the holster on his hip. "There he is," Kane said loudly, working the crowd. "The man stirring up trouble all over town." Grant didn't turn, didn't move. Kane stepped closer. "Mind telling these good people why you're spreading wild stories about a 30-year-old accident?" Grant finally faced him, his voice steady and low. "Because it wasn't an accident, and you know that." A few people gasped. Kane barked a laugh. The sound was sharp, aggressive, too loud for the small room. "Folks, this is what happens when someone doesn't get the help they need." He pats a file. PTSD can twist a mind until it starts believing the past is chasing it. Grant tightened his jaw. The old shame tried to rise, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about him anymore. Kane continued. "You're digging up ghosts, Holloway. Dangerous ones. And I won't let you unsettle this town." Grant lifted the flash drive between 2 fingers. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why your name and authorization code appear in a classified project tied to Echo Ridge Mine." Kane's face paled for half a second. "A flash. Quick. But not quick enough. People noticed." Carla frowned. "Sheriff, what's he talking about?" Kane recovered, forcing a smirk. "Probably some forged nonsense. The man barely knows what day it is. He'll say anything to justify breaking into county property." Grant placed the video recorder gently on the counter. Then hit play. Captain Reed's face flickered onto the small screen, washed in static and failing light. "If you're watching this, Kane sold seismic data overseas. The collapse wasn't an accident. He trapped me. He will try to bury the truth." The diner went silent. Dead silent. Kane's hand snapped toward his gun. Shadow stepped between them instantly, snarling so violently that half the room jumped back. His teeth flashed, hackles rising in a dark ridge along his spine. Even injured, he looked ready to tear through steel for Grant. Kane froze, hand hovering above the holster. Grant stared him down. "Make your move." "Go on." Kane's mouth tightened. His hand withdrew from the weapon, slow and shaking. "What is this garbage?" he shouted. "Old soldiers recording paranoid nonsense? Anyone could fake that tape." Then a voice came from the doorway. No one faked it. Megan Pierce stepped inside, breath unsteady, phone in hand. "I heard the yelling. And I heard what you just said, Sheriff." She turned her screen toward the crowd. "I already called the FBI." Kane's eyes widened. Grant felt the room tilt. Every pair of eyes swung from Megan to Kane to the video still playing. Reed's voice echoed again. "Kane will come for anyone who uncovers this." Kane pointed at Grant. "This man is unstable. He's dangerous. He attacked me last night." "You broke into his house." Megan shot back. "I saw the boot prints this morning." People shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered. He knew details Grant never said out loud. Another murmured. "Why is he so nervous if he's innocent?" Kane stepped backward, trying to recover control. "You don't understand what you're doing. These accusations could ruin a life." "Whose life?" Grant countered. "Yours or Captain Reed's?" At that moment, a black SUV rolled into view through the diner window. Another followed. The vehicles parked beside each other, headlights cutting through the snowy morning. 2 agents stepped out, badges raised. "Sheriff Robert Kane," one called. "We need to speak with you immediately regarding an active federal inquiry." Kane's face twisted. "This is ridiculous. This town needs me. He's lying. They're all—" But the words died in his throat. One agent stepped forward. "Sir, keep your hands visible." Shadow growled again, no longer threatening, but warning. Kane lifted his hands. The tension broke like a snapped cable as the agents closed in, guiding him outside. The sheriff didn't resist, but his eyes locked on Grant with a venom that said the fight wasn't over. Grant held the stare. Outside, the agents opened the SUV door. Kane paused at the threshold, his voice low, trembling with fury. "You should have left the past where it belonged, and you should have left my men alive." Grant answered. The door shut. The SUV rolled away. Inside the diner, no one spoke for several long seconds. Then Carla exhaled shakily. "Grant, what did you just uncover?" Grant rested a hand on Shadow's head. "Something Kane buried a long time ago." Shadow lifted his chin proudly, despite the pain in his ribs. Megan stepped closer, her voice low. "The FBI is setting up a full investigation. They want every file you found, and every recording." Grant nodded. For the first time, the truth wasn't trapped under a mine, or hidden in a bunker, or locked behind nightmares. It was out, moving, alive, and Kane wasn't the only one on their list now. Shadow nudged Grant's hand, guiding him toward the door. "We're far from done, buddy," he whispered, "but at least now justice is moving." Shadow gave a quiet, steady huff. Grant followed him out into the cold light of Mill Creek, the truth finally echoing louder than the past that tried to silence it. Mill Creek felt different the morning after Sheriff Kane was taken into federal custody. The town, usually taut like a wire stretched too tight, exhaled as if someone had finally loosened a knot that had been choking it for decades. People walked slower. They talked softer. Even the wind moving over the old roofs seemed to whistle with less tension. But for Grant Holloway, the silence felt earned, not empty. Shadow lay on a padded mat near the heater, ribs wrapped neatly, breathing steadier than the night before. Every so often, the shepherd's tail gave a small, tired thump just to let Grant know he was still here, still watching, still part of the fight. The dog's eyes never lost their sharpness, only softened by exhaustion. Grant knelt beside him, placing a hand lightly on Shadow's side. "You're coming back, buddy. Bit by bit." Shadow huffed in reply, leaning into Grant's palm. Even injured, he carried a dignity Grant could only hope to match. Shadow had taken the worst of the ambush, and still stood between Grant and danger without hesitation. No one in Grant's life had ever done that so completely, without condition. The tiny house creaked as the morning sun warmed the walls. A few neighbors had left baskets of food on the porch. A couple dropped tools Grant didn't ask for but clearly needed. Earl Maddox, who once mocked Grant louder than anyone, had left a note that simply said, "Sorry I was wrong about you. And the dog. Mostly the dog." Grant snorted once at that. Shadow twitched an ear, unimpressed. But Grant didn't linger long upstairs. Something pulled him downward, back into the bunker beneath the house, the place that once made his skin crawl, the place he had sworn never to enter alone. Now he climbed down the ladder slowly, lantern in hand. The cold air wrapped around him, familiar, but no longer hostile. The chamber greeted him with its usual metallic quiet. Except this time, Grant didn't feel hunted. The walls no longer felt like a tomb, they felt like a testament. He stepped deeper inside. For the first time, he didn't hear Afghanistan pressing in. No explosions ringing in the metal, no shouts ricocheting in his head, no sensation of dirt shifting under his boots like the ground itself wanted to swallow him whole. Instead, he heard only his own calm breath. He let the silence settle over him. He touched the edge of Captain Reed's last video recorder, the one still sitting on the steel desk. His fingers traced the dented casing. He waited for the usual tremor to rise in his hands when metal echoed faintly through the chamber. But it didn't come. Grant closed his eyes, letting that realization sink deep into him. The bunker hadn't changed, but Grant had. The truth had weight, but it didn't crush him now. It anchored him. He opened his eyes again. The hum of old wiring in the walls sounded less like ghosts and more like the echo of something Reed left behind for someone strong enough to carry it. Grant whispered into the stillness, "I heard you, Captain, and I got it out." The lantern flickered, shadows stretching across the steel. Footsteps shuffled above. Slow, careful ones. Shadow, despite his injuries, had gotten up to check on him again. Grant smiled softly and took one last look around the bunker before climbing back into the light. Shadow met him at the top of the ladder, tail wagging gently, eyes bright despite the pain. "Hey, boy," Grant murmured, kneeling to ruffle his fur. "I didn't think I'd ever breathe easy in that place. But you got me here. You brought me to the truth." Shadow pressed his forehead to Grant's chest, a gesture as grounding as a hand pulling a soldier out of rubble. Grant wrapped an arm around him carefully. The quiet of Mill Creek settled around them, not heavy, but peaceful. Tomorrow the FBI would bring more questions, more agents, more equipment, more digging. The mine would be reopened, at least partially. Evidence would surface. Reporters would sniff their way into town. It wouldn't stay peaceful for long. But today was a rare grace. Grant sat on the floor beside Shadow, leaning against the wall he once thought might collapse on him. The tiny house groaned softly in the wind, old but steady, stubborn in the way only a $1 shack could be. "You know," he whispered, "I used to think running made me a coward. But staying was harder than anything I've ever done." Shadow nudged his chin gently. Grant's voice softened. "And you stayed with me every step." Outside, children laughed somewhere near Main Street. Someone hammered boards onto a storefront. A truck rumbled past, slow and unhurried. Life was moving again. Better than before. The past was no longer something Grant feared to face. It was something he'd finally outrun, not by escaping it, but by dragging it into the light. He rested a hand on Shadow's head. Rest up, partner. The storm's not over. But at least now, we're not fighting the dark alone. For the first time in years, Grant Holloway felt something stir inside him that had nothing to do with fear or grief or guilt. Hope. Winter thinned across Mill Creek, leaving the mountains washed in pale sunlight and the scent of thawing pine. The town was quieter now, calmer, as if someone had finally lifted a weight no one realized they had been carrying. But the biggest change wasn't on Main Street. It was beneath the little $1 house on the edge of the abandoned mine. Grant Holloway stood at the top of the ladder, hands on his hips, staring down into the newly lit chamber below. Fresh wiring ran along the walls. New boards covered the unstable sections of flooring. Shelves were built from salvaged lumber. The old metal door, once buried in fear and dust, now bore a hand-painted sign. Reed Haven. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't a bunker anymore either. It was something between a memorial and a heartbeat. Grant had spent days cleaning it out, reinforcing the structure, cataloguing the files Captain Reed left behind. Every page, every tape, every scrap of evidence had a place now. Nothing hidden, nothing buried, nothing left to rot in silence. Shadow limped forward beside him, slow but steady, ribs healing beneath his thick coat. He paused at the edge of the opening, ears lifted, tail giving a small wag as if announcing he was ready for duty. Grant knelt next to him, rubbing the side of his neck. "This is your post now, huh?" Shadow nudged his shoulder with a soft grunt, settling himself, beside the ladder like a guardian stone. He took his role seriously. Anyone descending into Reed Haven had to pass those amber eyes first. People came faster than Grant expected. It started with Frank Brewer, a Vietnam veteran who lived an hour away. He had read the news, followed the whispers, and driven down to Mill Creek with a folder of old letters clutched tightly in his hands. He stood in the doorway awkwardly, as if unsure he was welcome. Grant led him inside without a word. Frank walked around the chamber slowly, touching the metal walls, studying the maps, reading the notes Reed left behind. When he reached the section dedicated to lost soldiers, he stopped moving entirely. His breath hitched. Then he whispered a name Grant didn't recognize. "My captain, I never knew what happened to him." Grant didn't interrupt. He knew what it felt like to speak a ghost's name out loud after decades of silence. Word spread across Montana. Within a week, 3 more veterans showed up. Then 5. Then 9. A retired Army engineer arrived with a box of old field journals he'd kept hidden from his family. A widowed Air Force mechanic came because she wanted her husband's dog tags to hang somewhere other than a drawer. A Marine in his 20s, fresh from deployment, walked in one morning with shaking hands and walked out with steady ones. Each of them contributed something small: a story, a photograph, a name, a piece of themselves. Grant arranged their mementos in the chamber carefully, giving every soldier a place in the growing mosaic of memory. Reed Haven became a living archive, built not from stone, but from the truth people had been forced to carry alone. Shadow welcomed every visitor with the same ritual, standing guard at the ladder, sniffing each person gently, leaning into their hands when they reached down to pet him. Grant noticed something that never failed to stir his chest. No one ever looked at Shadow like he was broken. To them, he was proof of survival, of courage, of loyalty that didn't falter even in the dark. People began calling him the Keeper, sometimes the Sentinel, sometimes simply Shadow, said with the kind of reverence reserved for men who carried brothers out of fire. Grant wasn't sure he deserved the same respect, but he accepted it for Shadow's sake. One afternoon, while he adjusted lighting inside the bunker, he heard footsteps approaching outside. Not hurried, not timid, a familiar rhythm. Megan Pierce appeared at the top of the trail, a camera slung over her shoulder again. She smiled softly. Thought I'd come see how things are shaping up. Grant wiped dust from his hands. You're just in time. We're almost finished with the last section. Megan knelt to greet Shadow first. The shepherd leaned into her palm, tail giving a slow sweep across the floor. Then she looked down into the chamber. Her eyebrows lifted. This looks incredible, Grant. You did all this? Not alone, he said, nodding at Shadow. He's quality control. Nothing goes down there unless he approves it. Megan laughed. Then her expression softened. People are calling it a miracle, you know, that you found this place, that you exposed what happened. Grant shook his head. No miracle, just the truth finally having a place to breathe. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. You're giving a lot of people something they never had before, a way to speak, a way to heal. Grant looked past her toward the mountains, the snow melting in streaks of white and gold. Healing's a messy road, but it's better than standing still. Later that evening, when Megan left and the quiet settled again, Grant walked down into Reed Haven alone. The lanterns lit the chamber with a warm amber glow. Papers rustled gently as a draft moved through the room. He rested a hand on Captain Reed's journal. You didn't die for nothing, sir. Above him, Shadow barked once, just a soft alert that meant he was watching the entrance. Grant smiled to himself. This was no longer just a bunker. It wasn't a graveyard. It was a promise. One that lived on through every story told, every confession whispered into the dim light, every veteran who climbed down the ladder and realized they no longer had to carry their ghosts alone. And through Shadow, limping but unbroken, guarding the threshold like he always had guarded Grant. This was their legacy now. Not fear, not silence, but truth, restored and risen. Snow drifted down in slow, wandering flakes, the kind that didn't rush to the ground but floated like they were choosing where to land. Late afternoon light washed Mill Creek in soft gold, turning the old mining ridge into a quiet silhouette. Winter in Montana had a way of making the whole world feel like it was holding its breath. Grant Holloway sat on the front steps of the $1 tiny house, a blanket draped over his shoulders, a mug of steaming coffee at his feet. The porch still creaked, still leaned a little, but it had a sturdiness now that matched the man who lived beside it. Below the house, Reed Haven glowed with warm light through the cracks in the floorboards. Voices sometimes drifted up, veterans sharing stories, or simply sitting in silence together. Tonight it was quiet. Shadow lay beside Grant, ribs healed but leaving behind a slight hitch in his gait. It didn't bother him. The shepherd had accepted his limp the way he accepted everything else in life, without complaint, without hesitation, without letting it slow the watch he kept over this strange little corner of Montana. Cars passed occasionally on the gravel road. No one shouted anymore. No one laughed at the man who bought a broken house for $1. Instead, they slowed down, rolled down their windows, raised a hand in greeting. Some just stopped entirely. One woman stepped out of her truck holding a paper bag. "Fresh huckleberry pie," she said shyly. "For your dog." Shadow lifted his head, tail thumping once in polite approval. Another passerby, a teenage boy, knelt in the snow to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "Thank you for your service," he whispered. Grant didn't correct him. He knew the words were meant for both of them. Mill Creek had changed. Maybe because the truth had finally been dug up. Or maybe because seeing a wounded dog continue to guard a broken house reminded people of something they forgot they admired. Loyalty that never asked for anything in return. Grant exhaled slowly, watching the cloud of his breath fade into the winter air. His gaze drifted to the open hatch behind him, the faint hum of the lights below. He still felt echoes sometimes, sensations from Afghanistan that pressed in when the wind hit just right or when a car door slammed too hard. But they didn't own him anymore, because every time the world tried to pull him backward, Shadow nudged him forward. The shepherd shifted, resting his head gently on Grant's boot. His eyes scanned the quiet valley, alert, steady, always aware. Grant knew the dog wasn't looking for threats. Not tonight. Shadow was simply keeping watch the way he always had, like it was in his blood, like it was the thing he was born to do. Grant placed a hand on the dog's thick fur. "You didn't just find what was hidden," he murmured. "You showed me what was worth saving." Shadow pushed his nose against Grant's palm, as if saying he already knew. The light from Reed Haven flickered beneath them, steady and warm. A sanctuary born from a lie, rebuilt into truth. A bunker turned into a beacon. The final resting place of a captain who refused to let his story die in the dark. Snow settled on Shadow's back. Grant brushed it away gently. "We're still here, buddy. Still standing, still guarding." Shadow lifted his head toward the fading sun, ears twitching at some distant sound only he could hear. The shepherd didn't bark, didn't growl. He just watched, calm and ready, as if promising the valley that nothing would sneak up on them again. Grant leaned back against the railing, letting a rare peace settle over him, the kind he never thought he'd feel again. The kind that came only after facing the dark, dragging it into the open, and finding you weren't alone in the fight. He glanced at the camera Megan had left behind for him to film his own messages to incoming veterans. Maybe he'd use it tonight. Maybe he'd talk about Reed Haven. Maybe he'd talk about Shadow. Or maybe he'd talk about the strange, quiet hope that had taken root here, one that felt stronger than any fear he'd carried from the battlefield. As the sky dimmed, Grant spoke softly, half to himself, half to the dog at his feet, half to anyone out there who needed to hear it. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" The shepherd beside him huffed, curling closer as the snow thickened. Grant chuckled quietly. "And if this story meant something to you, stick around. Support the channel. There are more stories coming. Honest ones, hard ones, beautiful ones. And Shadow here?" Grant scratched the dog's neck gently. "He's got plenty more to tell." The tiny house groaned softly. The mine ridge stood silent. Shadow watched the drifting snow like it was an old friend returning. Still watching, still guarding, always.